There's something unsettling about someone who laughs at the wrong time, who smiles in silence, who seems to wander through life without certainty, yet carries a strange kind of light in their eyes. You've seen people like this. Maybe you are one. Maybe you've always felt like the misfit in the room, too sensitive, too strange, too much. And yet, beneath that discomfort, a question lingers. What if the one who looks like a fool is actually the only one awake? Carl Jung called this figure an archetype, the fool, not in the sense of stupidity, but of sacred paradox. The fool does not obey logic. The fool does not need approval. The fool walks on the edge of meaning, laughing where others are silent, crying where others pretend strength. And in doing so, he opens a crack in the mask of reality, a crack wide enough for the unconscious to emerge, wide enough for the soul to breathe. We live in a culture obsessed with knowledge, with control, with certainty. We are taught that to be taken seriously, we must always know what to say, what to do, who to be. And so we learn to fear what makes us look naive. We exile our inner fool, the part of us that dares to not know, dares to feel too much, dares to make mistakes. But Jung warned us, what we repress returns. What we hide becomes shadow. And in the fool, often, lies the very shadow we need to face in order to become whole. Because the fool carries something we've forgotten. The courage to be ridiculous. The freedom to not fit. The wisdom to move without needing a destination. And that wisdom terrifies the ego. It terrifies the part of us that built a life around being correct, composed, acceptable. But life is not a straight line. Healing is not a formula. And the soul does not speak in bullet points. That's why the fool matters. Because he reminds us that transformation often begins in collapse, in nonsense, in the breakdown of the known. The tarot calls him the zero, the beginning of the hero's journey. Not because he has answers, but because he dares to begin with nothing. No armor, no map, only presence. This episode is not about being silly. It's about reclaiming the parts of you that feel out of place. The parts you silence to survive. The parts that laugh when they should cry, or cry when they should be fine. The parts that scare people because they see too clearly through what is false. Maybe your pain is not a mistake. Maybe your confusion is not failure. Maybe the part of you they called foolish is your beginning, your opening, your freedom. And if you listen closely, you might hear him again, the inner fool, laughing softly, not at you, but for you, because he knows something you've forgotten, that sometimes, only by losing the path, do we find the way back to ourselves. There are people who carry a kind of knowing they never asked for, people who, even as children, could sense the lies adults told themselves, who noticed the sadness behind the smile, who felt the room's energy shift long before anyone spoke, but because they had no words for it, they were called strange, too quiet, too dramatic, too much, or worse, too sensitive, as if feeling deeply were a flaw. To be invisibly wise is not glamorous. It hurts. It isolates. It creates a silent fracture between what you see and what the world allows you to speak, because the world doesn't want to be reminded of its contradictions. It prefers noise over truth, performance over authenticity. So those who carry quiet wisdom are often dismissed, not because they're wrong, but because they make others uncomfortable. Many who embody the archetype of the fool remember a childhood not of innocence, but of exile. They weren't celebrated for their insight. They were laughed at, ignored, or labeled as weird. This isn't just social discomfort. It's trauma, the kind that doesn't leave visible scars, but buries itself deep in the psyche, shaping a self that learns to adapt, to shrink, to pretend. When a child sees more than the adults around them can tolerate, they often begin to doubt their own perception. They start to wear a mask, not of joy, but of compliance. They become experts at mirroring what's expected while silencing what's real. And with time, that silence grows into shame, a quiet belief that there must be something wrong with me. If no one else sees what I see, this adaptation becomes the false self. Jung spoke of it as the persona, the mask we create to survive in society. And while the persona protects, it also disconnects. It separates us from our essence, from the strange and beautiful fool inside who once dared to feel without apology. So here we are, adults still carrying the echoes of a childhood where truth was too heavy to hold. Adults who learned that honesty might cost connection, who learned to stay quiet, to stay small, to stay hidden. But beneath all that adaptation, the inner fool waits, still foolish, still free, still aching to be seen. Because the pain of being invisibly wise is not just about being misunderstood by others. It's about forgetting that what made you different was never a defect. It was a gift. A dangerous gift, yes, but one that might still save you. Some truths can't be seen with the eyes open. Some only arrive when the usual logic fails, when the rules break, when the map burns, when everything that once made sense begins to unravel. That's when the fool appears, not with answers, but with presence, with a gaze that moves sideways, with a smile that disrupts, with a kind of intelligence that doesn't fit in the grid of rationality, but somehow sees deeper. The mind we are trained to trust is linear. It seeks order, sequence, predictability. But the psyche, the unconscious, the soul, they don't follow that path. They speak in symbols, in dreams, in contradictions. And the fool, more than any other archetype, knows how to listen to what doesn't make sense. He doesn't demand clarity. He welcomes chaos. He walks inside paradox and finds coherence where others only see confusion. In times of collapse, internal or collective, the linear mind often panics. It wants control, certainty, solutions. But the fool knows that in these moments, survival requires something else. Flexibility, intuition, and the courage to look absurd. He becomes the embodiment of what the neuroscientists call associative thinking. He doesn't follow a script. He connects fragments. He links images, memories, intuitions. And from the mess emerges something true. Schopenhauer once described life as being governed not by rational will, but by an irrational force he called the will, a blind, striving energy that pulses beneath our decisions, our desires, our despair. The fool feels that will. He dances with it. He doesn't try to dominate it with logic, but to listen with the whole body. And in that listening, he often discovers what the philosopher never could, that surrender is sometimes more powerful than control. The paradox is this: the more you try to be sane in an insane world, the more you lose yourself. But when you allow some madness in, not chaos for its own sake, but the fertile madness of the heart, something shifts. A doorway opens. A deeper rhythm takes over. And in that rhythm, strange insights emerge. Insights that don't sound smart, but feel true. Insights that can't be explained, but change everything. The fool doesn't mock reason. He just knows its limits. He knows that beneath the polished ideas and clever arguments, there's a mystery too vast to name, a wisdom too wild to tame. And he knows that if we stop insisting on always making sense, maybe, just maybe, we might finally begin to understand. There's a kind of suffering that doesn't come from failure or rejection, but from the unbearable weight of our own seriousness. From the belief that we must always be wise, composed, certain. From the quiet tyranny of trying to be good all the time, right all the time, enlightened all the time. It's a subtle kind of prison, and it often wears the mask of growth. The more we identify with the image of the awake one, the more we fear anything that might look like regression. The more we strive for spiritual clarity, the more we repress the chaos still living inside us. And so, we stop laughing, we stop stumbling, we stop questioning, we become rigid, silent, imprisoned in the very wisdom we thought would free us. Nietzsche warned us about this, about the danger of moral rigidity dressed as virtue. He spoke of the spiritually serious, who in denying their instincts, also denied their vitality. For him, true freedom, geistige Freiheit, emerged not through control, but through courage. The courage to live with contradictions, to embrace the instinctual, the raw, the animal within, to stop pretending we are pure, and instead become whole. Taking ourselves too seriously isn't just tiring, it's dangerous. It turns us into judges, of others and of ourselves. It makes failure unacceptable, vulnerability intolerable. It turns life into a test rather than a mystery, and slowly, without noticing, we become brittle, proud but disconnected, noble but numb. The fool disrupts that. He laughs, not to escape truth, but to expand it. He laughs at himself, not from self-hate, but from self-recognition. He sees his own absurdity. He holds his contradictions without shame. And in that laughter, there's something deeply healing, something that reminds us we are not here to be perfect. We are here to be real. Because when we lose the ability to laugh at ourselves, we also lose the ability to grow. Growth requires humility, not the kind that bows to others, but the kind that bows to the unknown. The kind that says, I don't know everything. I'm still learning. I'm still becoming. The fool teaches us that freedom doesn't come from having the right answers, but from being brave enough to sit with the wrong ones, to fall, to get back up, and to laugh, not despite the fall, but because of it. Because in that laughter, we find our humanity again. There's a part of you that you've likely hidden away, not because it was wrong, but because it was misunderstood. A part that didn't speak in logic or politeness. A part that spoke in images, in wild phrases, in strange laughter, in sudden tears. That part, your inner fool, is still there, waiting, not for approval, but for a moment of honesty. Sometimes, the door to that part opens when you stop trying to sound intelligent. When you write, not from your mind, but from a place deeper, less edited, more alive. You can begin by letting that hidden voice speak. Not the voice that explains. The voice that disrupts, that interrupts, that surprises you. Write without expecting sense, without structure. Let your inner fool speak in metaphors, in broken thoughts, in absurd confessions. Then sit with what appears, not to judge, but to witness. You might hear things you didn't expect. You might read something and feel both confused and strangely seen. That's the point. The fool doesn't speak to be understood. He speaks to be felt. And in feeling, something buried begins to move. There are moments in life that seem too strange to make sense. You encounter someone who says something bizarre. You're drawn to a situation that seems irrational. Most people dismiss these moments. But what if you stayed with them a little longer? What if, instead of judging the absurd, you listened to it, with your body, with your silence, with your curiosity? Often, what seems nonsensical at first glance is carrying a deeper pattern, a symbolic truth, trying to find you. Theater has long known this. In therapeutic spaces, the act of becoming someone else, of switching roles, playing the opposite, embodying what you fear, can reveal more than years of analysis. Because when you let yourself play, you drop the mask, and in that moment, your inner fool steps forward. Not to entertain, but to liberate. Not to perform, but to reveal. These aren't techniques in the traditional sense. They're invitations. Invitations to loosen the grip of control, to explore what happens when you stop making sense, when you trust the symbolic, the dreamlike, the irrational, because sometimes the deepest wisdom lives where your ego refuses to look, in the part of you that you've mocked, ignored, shamed. And yet, that very part may be the one holding the key, not to who you should become, but to who you truly are. History remembers kings and generals. It remembers their power, their triumphs, their downfall. But somewhere in the margins of every kingdom, there was someone else. Someone dressed in absurd colors. Someone allowed to speak nonsense. Someone who, in pretending to be foolish, could say the one thing no one else dared to say. The truth. The court jester was not just comic relief. He was the secret conscience of the king, the only one who could challenge the throne without losing his head. He spoke in riddles, in jokes, in laughter, but beneath the laughter, there was a blade, a sharpness, a clarity no minister could afford to voice. And so, when the king lost his way, when power clouded judgment, it was often the fool who pulled him back from the edge, not with arguments, but with a question that pierced, with a story that revealed, with a joke that exposed the shadow hiding beneath the crown. This is not just an old tale, It happens in every age, in every family, in every society. Those who seem ridiculous, awkward, offbeat, are often the ones seeing what no one else wants to see. They sense hypocrisy not because they're cynical, but because they haven't been fully trained to ignore it. They carry a kind of clarity that looks like madness only to those who've forgotten how to feel. Think of the artists who were mocked before they were celebrated, the comedians who disguised philosophy and humor, the misfits who walked alone for years before the world finally caught up to their vision. Not because they were better, but because they were willing to be misunderstood. They were willing to lose status, comfort, belonging in order to say something real. There is a strange loneliness in being the fool, a deep ache in knowing that your truth may only be seen in retrospect, that your clarity might first be mistaken for delusion, that your laughter might be heard as defiance instead of grief. And yet, there is also a quiet power, a sense of freedom that comes from no longer needing to belong to illusions. How many times in your life have you played that role? The one who saw the cracks when others saw perfection. The one who was laughed at, dismissed, forgotten, only to be remembered much later as someone who was right all along. And how many times have you silenced that voice within, just to keep the peace, just to fit in, just to not feel the sting of being the strange one again? Maybe that's the cost of vision. Maybe the fool saves the kingdom. Not by being understood, but by daring to speak before anyone's ready to hear. What if the fool's not the one who doesn't understand, but the one who refuses to pretend? What if in his laughter there is mourning? What if in his chaos there is order being born? Nietzsche, in his vision of the eternal return, imagined a world where every moment repeats, again and again, eternally, not as punishment, but as a test. Can you affirm your life so completely that you would choose to live it over and over, even the pain? The fool, perhaps more than anyone, says yes, not because life is easy, but because life in its absurdity is still sacred. He doesn't need life to make sense. He dances with its nonsense. He doesn't need meaning to be fixed. He lets it evolve. He doesn't wait for permission to exist. He already is, fully, messily, joyfully, painfully, free. In a world that rewards control, the fool embodies surrender. In a culture obsessed with being right, he reminds us of the power of being real. In a time that exiles what it cannot categorize, the fool becomes the bridge between logic and soul, between shadow and light, between what is broken and what is whole. He's not an escape from seriousness. He is the medicine for its poison, the breath inside the silence, the child inside the mask, the soul inside the system. And maybe that's why he scares us, because he doesn't just challenge our image. He threatens to awaken something we buried a long time ago, the part of us that still believes in beauty, even amidst the ruins, the part that still feels wonder, even after the fall, the part that dares to laugh, even with tears in its eyes. So we end where we began, with a question. What if the true madness is not in the fool, but in the world that fears him? What if the wisdom we've been searching for has been laughing at our feet all along?